Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm Tom.
And this is episode number 21. So we just want to thank everybody for listening to our episode last week, the Edmund Fitzgeralds. We got some really good feedback about it, but I'd really like to know more of what you guys think happened. So if you missed that episode, if you haven't listened to that one yet, definitely go check it out. There's a lot of mystery about what happened to that ship. And, we definitely, like I said, want to hear what you guys think happened. And we also had just one piece of housekeeping that we wanted to do. So Tom and I have kind of been talking and making plans through the spring and topics we're going to cover. And there's a couple weeks where we have a lot going on in our personal lives. So we may put out those mini episodes that we did for Christmas and New Year's, or we might skip a week or two here and there. So as we get closer to that, we'll let you guys know what the plan is for the next week. But we just want to throw that out there. If you guys do have suggestions for mini episodes, something that might not take as much research that we can do in maybe, 15 to 30 minutes in that span. So we're definitely open to anything. Send us comments, questions, episode suggestions to the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com.
This would probably be happening around Easter into May.
So for our listeners, Tom is actually the Easter Bunny.
I don't really talk about my my day job, but yeah, you caught me. I'm the Easter Bunny. I'm starting to grow out the ears. I'm already working on the bushy tail. We try to plan these out as far in advance as we can, but a lot of times life just gets in the way, and things that come up that we are not going to be able to get around. So as this comes up, we will keep you, the audience, informed as to what's happening. It's not going to be anytime soon. When this would be happening would be sometime between like end of March into mid-May. Once we know what's happening and what our plans are, then you guys will know what our plans are. And as always, things are kind of always subject to change depending on our day jobs, unfortunately, too. That was the first piece of podcast business. Before we get into the episode, I do want to bring up something as well. And it's another hockey episode. And one of the things we're going to be talking a lot about is the Canadian Hockey Federation, Hockey Canada. And if you're a hockey fan, you know that Hockey Canada has been in the news recently over the last year and a half for a lot of not great things. Especially in the last week, there was news that came out about a horrific and despicable event that occurred a couple of years ago. I won't get into the details now, but I will say we're not going to be discussing that. We're not going to be discussing anything about Hockey Canada as an organization as a whole. Basically, any discussion of Hockey Canada is going to be limited to the context of what we're talking about. What I will say, by the time this comes out, there may be more news on that current event, more news than we had in the last week that we recorded this. All I will say is that we send our thoughts and our prayers and our love to the victim, and may she find peace and strength and hopefully justice out of that. And that's really where we'll leave it.
Yes, very well said.
And with that, as one podcaster once said, unfortunately, there's no easy way to segue from that, but it's just the nature of it. We will be taking a hard left turn. On that note, who wants to talk about some geopolitics and international intrigue around the game of hockey?
I'm excited about this. I don't know this story at all. I think you're going to weave in part of a related story that I know a bit about, but I'm excited to hear this.
So what we are going to be talking about today is the official name was the 1972 8-game exhibition between Canada and the USSR. It has later been known to be called either the Summit Series or the Series of the Century. It is a incredible kind of drama, and it is very much the Cold War almost played out on a micro scale, but with all of the macro aggressions that came with it. But basically, this was a nugget that had started in, I think it was 1971. As the story goes, the Canadian embassy in Moscow was reading the Russian papers to see what was being said.
That's a thing.
I guess it was back in 1971.
And for those that don't know, there's a lot of there's context here that's important about what was going on between the USSR and the rest of the world.
Just to kind of put a little bit of a bracket around where this is happening in the point in time. This is really kind of the height. If we're talking about really the height of what the Cold War was, it's really from the early 60s through really the late 80s. We're about 10 years removed from the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're about 10 years removed from the Bay of Pigs. Late 50s and through the 60s, you had the space race as well. So all of that is happening just between America and the USSR.
It was a lot of tension.
It was a lot of tension. And, you speak to someone who lived through that, there was a real fear by a lot of normal people that the world was going to end in a second. The fear was very real. We can go back and forth on how close things actually got, but for a lot of people, it got close enough. It's as this is all happening, Canada, who is not really a player in the Cold War, but obviously their interests align pretty closely with America's. There's still a street in Montreal named literally President Kennedy Street.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was extremely popular. Extremely popular. Basically, as the story goes, in 1971, the Canadian embassy in Moscow is reading the daily papers, and they're reading the official paper of the Soviet government, or what's supposedly the official print arm of the government. And there's a nugget in a column by a sports columnist about that there should be a series between the Soviets and Canada to determine who was the premier hockey power. And as the reasoning goes, that columnist would not have put that in there without either implicit or express orders to do so from people above him.
Where did you think that came from? I mean, obviously we're talking higher ups in Russia, but like just to prove that they were the superpower, like what was the intent behind that?
So basically, I'm leaving out a lot of geopolitical context here because I think everyone kind of knew what everyone else was doing at this point. The Russians probably knew that there was a guy at the Canadian embassy's job to read all of their papers. So they knew they were going to see it. And Canada knew that sports, and more importantly, winning at sports, is very, very important to the Soviet government. It was kind of a way to legitimize what they were doing on the world stage in their mind. Sports were a very important kind of arm in what the government there was trying to accomplish.
It's funny, I was thinking in my mind that it almost seems like some kind of flex, for the Russians.
Well, and that's it too, is so the backstory of this is both countries are kind of looking at this from their own selfish gain. Canada had never had an opportunity to have a national all-star team of NHL players. At that time, under international rules, professional players were not allowed to play in international competition. The two big ones at the time being the Olympics and the yearly World Championships.
Do you know when that changed?
It was probably, I think it was around the 80s. It really kind of started with this. So Canada was looking at this as an opportunity to finally have the best players they could get the best players in the world, as in their minds, show their might on an international stage for the first time. By this point, too, Canada had also become very sick of losing to Russia. By the early 1970s, the Soviets had become the premier hockey power on the international stage. Now, the way it's always described is they were officially amateurs, but they were essentially playing professionally and essentially being subsidized by the government. They were amateurs in name, but not really for all intents and purposes, they were not amateurs.
So my question is, did Russia have any professional hockey league like the US and Canada?
They had club teams. A lot of the players that would play on the national team played for the Red Army team in Moscow, which was the preferred team of the government. One of the reasons why they were also so dominant is the team basically played together constantly. And they were also, well, for all intents and purposes, professional athletes. They were housed all together. All they basically did was practice. By this point, I think they had won, 10 straight world championships. They had won, I think, 5 of the last 6 gold medals at the Olympics. And Canada could not compete because they couldn't send professional players.
Well, that's what I was getting at. So playing for those clubs didn't bar any of those Russian players from playing in the Olympics, is what you're saying. My thought on it was kind of what you started to say there. Maybe the thinking with the Russians is not only are, like you said, they're the premier players around the world, but also knowing that Canada couldn't send their professional league players. Like, it's almost like, okay, we know we can beat them, and now we definitely know we can beat them,
Well, exactly. And so what happens is this columnist basically throws the idea out there that the world competition is just now too small for the Russian team. There's no point in playing the rest of the world. And so they now need to play the Canadian professionals because that's the last true test remaining for them. And this is a theme through this entire affair, is that there's a lot of gamesmanship happening here. And there's a lot of national pride that becomes very much entangled into this, and national identity that becomes very much entangled into this.
For Russia or Canada or both?
For both.
For both. Got it.
For Russia, this was very important to basically flex as a show of military and governmental strength. For Canada, this was a test of the national identity. At this point in the mid-70s, Canada is very much defined on the international stage by hockey. And so this is still very much what they are defined by internationally, and also how they define themselves. So their self-worth as a country is very much tied into their love of the sport, their obsession with the sport, how the sport is intrinsically embedded in the culture of the country, and what their prowess in playing the sport means to them as Canadians. So over the next months, the governments essentially negotiate a deal to play this 8-game series. 4 would be played in Canada, 1 in Montreal, 1 in Toronto, 1 in Winnipeg, and 1 in Vancouver. Then there would be about a 10-day break where Russia would play in Czechoslovakia, and Canada would play the Swedish team in Stockholm. Almost kind of a 10-day break, and also, and to stay in quote unquote game shape during that time between the games in Canada and the games in Moscow.
So this wasn't part of the Olympics. This was its own thing, its own exhibition,
This was its own exhibition that was basically negotiated between the two governments, and essentially negotiated the terms of play.
I'm sorry, this is very like Rocky 3 vibes when he fights the Russian, right?
Yeah. The only thing missing is Drago. Now you have the terms of engagement, so now you need the players. It's by this point that Alan Eagleson, who is a high-powered agent who represents a lot of the NHL players, basically then inserts himself into the negotiations to make sure that NHL players can participate. So he brokers a deal that a lot of the money that the players would get would go into the league's pension fund. He basically negotiates a deal between the owners to allow the players to play this series. Now, notably, both sides are missing some of their better players. The Canadian side doesn't have Bobby Orr. At this point in 1972, Bobby Orr is one of the dominant players in the game. If you know anything about Bobby Orr, he revolutionizes how defensemen play. He was unavailable because he had suffered an injury during the playoffs the year before and would not be available to play during this series, which was going to happen before the NHL season in 1972, September 1972.
I bet he was devastated not to be able to participate in this.
You hear a lot from two players regarding the Summit Series. One is Bobby Clarke, and Bobby Clarke's going to play a very integral role in this in exactly the way you would expect Bobby Clarke to play an integral role in this. And we'll get to him later on. The other one you hear a lot from is Phil Esposito. And Phil Esposito, Hockey Hall of Famer, most of his career with either the Boston Bruins and the New York Rangers. Very outspoken, very brash personality. Again, you're going to hear from him a little bit as we go on here. But he talked about a lot that they did not do this to get paid. They did this because for a lot of them, this was their first opportunity to represent the country on the international stage and to wear the maple leaf on their chest. And that was a big deal for a lot of them. That was a very big deal for a lot of them. For the Russians, it had kind of become a little bit of old hat because they had been playing for them for so long. It was kind of old hat.
That's a really good point to kind of distinguish where they both were approaching this. Yeah.
I should also mention, too, that the Canadians also did not have Bobby Hull, and that was because Bobby Hull had signed on to play for the World Hockey Association, and that was basically viewed as punishment for leaving the NHL. It was kind of a power play to try and crush the WHA as a rival league, which would eventually happen by the end of the 70s, but at the time, it was a new league. The Russians actually didn't have one of their best players, too. The player that was considered the Bobby Hull of Russia, Anatoly Firsov, he didn't play. He was not named to the team. And that was in part as retaliation because he did not like the head coach that was named for the Russian team. So already you're kind of seeing how this is working. There were also terms of engagement in terms of scouting, in terms of allowing each side to scout and view practices and allowing practice times.
That's interesting to me because I would think that both sides would already have a list of players that they want to do this.
The Soviets basically just took a lot of their own players from the Red Army team. The Canadian team took a lot of Alan Eagleson's clients, and he used that as kind of leverage to basically name himself the general manager of the team. It is very interesting because in the Ross Greenberg Summit Series documentary that NBC put out about 10 years ago, you hear a lot of the Canadian players, whether it was Esposito or Paul Henderson or Rod Gilbert, talk about how there wasn't really a training camp. Back in those days, the players, once the season ended, they just went and did nothing for 3 months. And there would be about a 6-week training camp that started in September, and that would be used to get into game shape or kind of game shape-ish for the season. So this was something completely different for them when they got called to join Team Canada. They were ramping up a lot earlier than they would have been.
To qualify for the team in Canada, did you need to be Canadian born or just live in Canada? Like my thought,
born, yeah.
Okay, because my thought was, let's say they played in the NHL for a U.S. team. As long as they were born in Canada, it was fine.
Yeah, or Canadian citizenship.
Okay, got it.
And it's the same thing with anything under international rules. You either have to be born in the country or you have to have citizenship in the country to be eligible to play for the national team. So they openly talk about how they were kind of fucking around during the training camp. There's video of some of the players, skating around during training camp in slacks, in bell-bottom pants and slacks, kind of just lazily passing the puck around. This was they were just having a good old time. And a lot of that is because there was a lot of arrogance from not just the team, but the government and the media that the Russian team was going to get crushed here. A lot of scouts, a lot of reporters were predicting that Russia would win maybe one game, maybe, if not get completely swept all 8 games. There was one columnist for the Toronto Star who famously wrote that if Russia wins a game, he would take his column, dip it in borscht, and literally eat his words outside the Russian embassy in Toronto.
That seems very extreme.
It seems very extreme, and it's also kind of indicative of hockey writing in Canada from time to time. There is very much a sense of entitlement and arrogance when it comes to hockey in Canada and kind of gatekeeping. But this was kind of the sentiment that this was going to be a cakewalk. They especially felt that way after they had scouted the Russian goaltender, Vladislav Tretiak, who had, on the game that they had scouted him, allowed 8 goals. And they thought, the goalie's not good. This is going to be easy. What they didn't know, and whether this was gamesmanship or just plain luck, is that game was played the day after Tretiak's wedding. As people are wont to do at weddings, you may have had a couple.
I was going to say, it sounds like he was hungover.
And that pretty much was what happened. He had a couple and he was hungover, allegedly.
So I assume that the Canadians didn't know that.
They did not.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those kind of little things that are become very ubiquitous during all of this. So we finally get to September of 1972, and the first game is played in the Montreal Forum, the legendary Montreal Forum. If hockey is religion, this is the cathedral in the city where it is religion, in Montreal. And the Canadians jump out to a very early lead. They score 2 goals within the first couple of minutes. They start to get very cocky. What happens after that is what Russians will later call the miracle. All of a sudden, the Russian style of play, which is very, very different, and that becomes apparent really early from how Canadians play. Canadians are a very physical, there's a lot of body checking. It is not really fluid. It's a lot of what you would call dump and chase, where you send the puck in and then just go and try to send the guy into the 5th row to try and remove him from the puck, and then just a lot of skating toward the net and just whacking away until the puck slides in. And this is how the games had always been played in the NHL. As one of the historians interviewed in the documentary had said, no one had ever really thought about the game because this is just how the game was played in Canada. It was just determined one day that this was going to be how it was played, and no one ever dared question it. By contrast, the Russian style was almost like soccer. It was fluid. There was constant movement, constant rotation, constant puck possession. Instead of having forward lines and defense lines, you had 5-man units. So basically the same 5 players would play on the ice together at all times. That was done to create continuity, so that basically everyone on the ice would know where the other one was going to be, and it's very fluid. It's constant rotation and movement. No one was standing still. And what ends up happening is within the first couple of minutes, Canada can't catch them. They can't keep up with the movement. They can't keep up with the skating. And before long, Russia is dominating them. And in fact, Russia does dominate them and wins easily the rest of the game. I think it was 7-3. And this is a shock for a roster that was filled with NHL players. A lot of them ended up going to the Hall of Fame. For them to then lose like that on home soil, on home ice, it almost created a crisis.
That's embarrassing.
Rod Gilbert tells the story of his brother being in the stands watching the game, and his brother telling him afterwards, after they had lost one game, that he was an embarrassment to the family and the country at whole.
All right, that's a little much. I mean, yes, embarrassing, but like let's take a break here. Let's
Lost
chill.
one game, you're an embarrassment to the family and to the entire country at whole.
Yeah, he's not allowed to have a bad game, or you know what I mean? That's a lot.
Lose again and we'll disown you. But this was kind of the sentiment after the first game. And sure enough, the Toronto columnist who said he would literally eat his words went outside the Russian embassy in Toronto, dipped his column in borscht, and literally ate the column.
I wonder if he got sick from that. Couldn't have tasted good.
Probably not. So after the embarrassing performance, they play the second game in Toronto at Maple Leaf Gardens, which is another mecca of the sport. And the Canadians come out a lot more aggressive. They're able to establish their physical play. They're able to basically be physical and really kind of lean physically on the Russian players. They're able to check them. They're able to kind of bump them. They're able to really kind of completely knock them off their game and slow them down to the point where the Russian team really had never seen this before. Just like Canada had never seen Russia's fluid movement before, Russia had never seen Canada's physicality before. When this happened, they melted down. And this becomes a theme for both sides because you're going to see this a lot later on.
So you got these big strapping men, both Russian and Canadian, just being little crybabies throughout
Pretty
this.
much, and that's an overwhelming theme. So Canada wins the second game, and the crisis is now lowered to DEFCON 2. The third game is played at the Winnipeg Arena in Winnipeg, an arena that was famous for having a giant picture of Queen Elizabeth on each end of the ice. Because sure, when they play Game 3 in Winnipeg, the Canadians come out strong again. They're able to get a lead, but Russia comes back, and they're able to draw a tie. So the teams tie in Winnipeg. Again, no one's feeling overly great, but it's definitely not as bad as it was in Montreal.
Was there no overtime? Or
No, there wasn't. It was just
no?
all in regulation. So the teams then go to the final game in Canada, which was played in Pacific Coliseum in Vancouver. At this point, Harry Sinden, who was the longtime Bruins coach who had been out of hockey but was tagged to be the coach of the Canadian team, he had promised a lot of the younger players that they were going to play in a game, especially in Canada. They had taken 35 players on the roster. So Sinden decides that this is a good time to get a lot of the players who had sat for the first three games in. What happens is an abject debacle by any measurable standard. The Russians basically play about as well as you can play. Canada plays about as horrible as you can play. The game becomes just a mess where Canada melts down, is just taking cheap shots all over the ice. And eventually the team is booed off of the ice.
Two things on that. First, so I kind of get that, because if you're that frustrated, you're losing, it's not feeling great, especially if it was these like, not as experienced or younger players. Like I can see where you're going to get chippy and you're going to get shitty. Like I get that. So I can't really blame them too much for that. And then my second, I have a question, but it's very inconsequential. Do you know like how far apart these first four games were? Was it like back-to-back days, or did they have a couple days?
It was a couple days off between, because remember their airplane travel. They're traveling literally from one end of the country to the other, from Montreal to Toronto to Winnipeg, which is like the central, all the way to the West Coast, Vancouver, which is right above Seattle. It's after the fourth game where they lose badly and do not look good doing it, that Phil Esposito, who's being heckled by his own fans the entire game, saying that communism is better. The mood in the country was very edgy, and the documentary talks a lot about how the players at this point, people were so fed up and getting so angry, and they were getting hate mail. I mean, they were basically seen as traitors to the country at this point because they had played so poorly.
I think that's a bit of a stretch.
It's a bit of a stretch, and it is very much kind of indicative of how much was writing on this. A lot more than really should have been. And it's at this point where Phil Esposito, who is interviewed after the game when fans are booing him, he is interviewed and he basically has enough. And he says, to the people across Canada, we tried, we gave it our best, and the people that boo us, geez, all of us guys are really disheartened and we're disillusioned and we're disappointed at some of the people. We cannot believe the bad press we've got, the booing we've gotten in our own buildings. If the Russians boo their players, the fans, Russians boo their players. Some of the Canadian fans, I'm not saying all of them, some of them booed us. And I'll come back and I'll apologize to each one of the Canadians, but I don't think they will. I'm really disappointed. I am completely disappointed. I cannot believe it. Some of our guys are really, really down in the dumps, you know. We're trying like hell. I mean, we're doing the best we can, and they got a good team, and let's face facts. But that doesn't mean that we're not giving it 150% because we certainly are. I mean, every one of us guys, 35 guys that came out here and played for Team Canada, we did it because we love our country and not for any other reason, no other reason. They can throw the money for the pension fund out the window. They can throw anything they want out the window. We came because we love Canada. And even though we play in the United States and we earn money in the United States, Canada is still our home. And that's the only reason we come. And I don't think it's fair that we should be booed.
One, it's super defensive, which I understand, and I probably would have felt the same way if I were them. But it's also a little bit antagonistic, no?
Well, in true good Canadian hockey man fashion, it's politely passive aggressive.
Yes, exactly.
Which is basically as animated as a Canadian hockey player will get, or is basically allowed to get. It is basically at this point where the team is getting ready to leave for Russia.
So at this point, when they head to Russia, it's 3-1 Canada? Or 2-2?
It's 2-1-1.
Oh, you're right, because they tied. Okay.
They tied. They lost in Montreal, they won in Toronto, they tied in Winnipeg, and they lost in Vancouver. So at this point now, if you're at all familiar with Canadian hockey media, you can imagine what's happening here. Because this is literally the only thing going on in the in the country at this point. A lot of civic life has basically shut down to watch these games. People are tuning in across the country to watch. Again, this is how much pressure is riding on this. And they're getting absolutely scorched in the press. They're getting scorched by their own families. It is now becoming an international debacle. And the funny thing is that Esposito speech actually kind of turns things around. As one of the historians on the documentary said, Americans' most famous speeches come from the battlefields of Gettysburg and the Congressional Congress. Canada's famous speech comes from a post-game interview by a hockey player at the Pacific Coliseum in 1972. What happens after that is there's a 10-day break. Russia goes home to play a tournament, a club tournament against other Russian teams. Canada ends up playing a 2-game, again, friendly exhibition against the Swedish national team. And it ends up being a blessing in disguise. One, because the team basically just gets out of Canada. They get away from the media pressure and just the intense kind of pressure, and they kind of get away from it all. The other thing that happens is they play 2 very competitive and physical games against the Swedish national team. They're very feisty, bloody affairs. Wayne Cashman, who's one of the Canadian players, actually gets injured when a Swedish player had a sharp end of a stick and shoved it into his mouth, causing basically ripping his tongue apart. He needed 50 stitches on his tongue. Hockey in the 70s was a time.
Yeah.
But the one thing that happens during all of that is the team starts to bond. there was a lot of talk about how a lot of these guys didn't really see each other as a team. These are all players that had played against each other in the NHL for 50, 60 games a year. They hated each other's guts, a lot of them. The ones who weren't teammates, and there were a lot of, obviously, because Harry Sinden was the former Bruins coach, there were a lot of Bruins on the team. There were 6 Montreal Canadiens on the team. So the players that were teammates liked each other, but everyone else kind of just were out there individually for themselves. And so what a lot of them kind of say is that those 10 days where they're away and then when they go to Moscow is when they start to bond and they start to become a more cohesive unit, like the Russian team is. So a lot of the Russian team had played with each other for years, had played since they were kids together. And it changes the tide. By the time they get to Moscow, the Canadian team is in a much different state. The pressure seems to be off, and they seem to be having a lot more fun. J.P. Parise actually tells a story about how popular the Canadian players were in Moscow because they had things that people in Russia didn't have. They had bell-bottom jeans and stylish jackets. They were almost kind of like movie stars. In fact, Parise tells a story about how kind basically the people, not necessarily the government, but the people, just the citizens of Russia were to them. He tells a story about giving a child a piece of gum and the child being very happy to have it, only to see a KGB agent basically knock it out of the kid's hand and take it for himself.
I was wondering when that part of the story was going to come up. But I also think, too, and given the context of what is happening currently with Russia, I do think that a lot of the non-military citizens are pretty decent people. Like, it is the government, it is the military, it is, it's not the everyday citizen that's terrible.
And not to get extremely, into the current political landscape, but, a lot of Russians face a lot of pressure for, daring to go against the government or to kind of defy the government. So it's in this current climate that the Canadians find themselves. Already before they even get to Russia, the gamesmanship has really taken another level. As part of the agreement, the Canadians were allowed to bring their spouses and their girlfriends and their partners. It wasn't until they were I think it was either about to leave or on the plane, about to leave for Moscow, that Russia tried to change the deal and said they wouldn't be able to come, or that they'd have to stay in separate hotels. During the time they're in Russia, there are constant calls to the alarms in the hotel and calls to the hotel and kind of little things like that.
It's so stupid and petty.
By the time they get to Game 5, the vibe already in the Canadian room has changed. There's a moment before Game 5 in Moscow when the teams are being introduced, and each Canadian player is being introduced on the blue lines, and they're getting flowers from Russian children as part of the ceremony. For some reason, Phil Esposito goes to skate out, and he slips on a pedal and he falls. It's at this moment that Phil Esposito, who's a very outspoken personality, decides he's going to take one for capitalism. And he looks directly, as he's on the ice, he is directly in the eyesight of Khrushchev, the premier, and he blows him a kiss. As he tells it, the soldiers and the guards that were around Khrushchev start laughing hysterically until Khrushchev looks back at them and they all stop. That being said, Canada still loses Game 5. So now they're down 3-1, and now they have to win the next 3 games to win the series.
No pressure or anything.
Yeah, no pressure. No pressure, none at all. Before Game 6, Coach Sinden makes what turns out to be a very important move, in that he plays Phil Esposito with at the time, somewhat kind of unknown guy named Paul Henderson. Paul Henderson played for the Maple Leafs. And their styles almost are a perfect match, and they become unstoppable. The Canadians win Game 6, a very, very chippy Game 6, where things kind of boil over. And it starts with Bobby Clark. Bobby Clark, who had become really angered by what was happening. One of the Russians' best players is a forward named Valery Kharlamov. And Bobby Clark decides he's going to take a piece out of Kharlamov. Clark, on a rush, races down the ice to catch him and basically takes a two-hand forearm axe with his stick to his ankle, breaking the ankle and completely changing the series. A huge fight ensues where at one point another Russian player starts kicking a Canadian player with his skate. It becomes a blood feud at this point. And by the middle of game 6, it is very clear that this is no longer just hockey. This is, as it turns out, one of the closest things we actually get to actual Cold War conflict. But Canada manages to win the game, and they win it on a game-winning goal from Paul Henderson. Game 7, Canada wins again on another game-winning goal by Paul Henderson. So he's now scored the game-winning goal in back-to-back games. He had been an unknown player for the first 4 or 5 games, but he becomes dominant in the last 2 games.
So they love him back in Canada right about now, right?
And all of a sudden, the tide back home has turned. They get telegrams shipped over to them from all over Canada talking about how proud the country is of them for coming back. This is despite the fact that they had food, milk, soda, and beer shipped over from Canada, and when they got to Russia, half of it was all missing. To which Phil Esposito responded, "None of that really bothered us except for the fact that they stole our beer."
I mean, that's what's important, right? Is the beer.
To a hockey player, yes. So we now reach game 8, and this is the deciding game. The winner of this game wins everything. At this point, each team has won 3 games with the 1 tie. So the winner wins the game. During the series, the 4 games in Russia specifically, Canada had complained about 2 of the referees. They felt that they were doing things that were unfair against Canada and favorable for the Russian players. What were considered weak penalties, things of that nature. They tried to petition to get the referees taken off the game to no avail. When game 8 starts, the quote-unquote soft calls continue. It's at this time, after what is considered a questionable call against Parise, that he snaps. He argues with the referee. He gets another misconduct, and then he decides, well, fuck it. If I have a misconduct, I'm going to earn it. And he decides to, and we'll put the video up, chase down the referee and act like he's going to swing at him with his stick. It's also during this time that Phil Esposito is so heated during a fight that he motions like he's going to fight the player in the penalty box. And he does it during the universal language, throat slashing and going, "You, me, punchy, punchy."
You showed me a clip of this before we recorded, and it's pretty scary. He was serious.
One of the things that happens a lot during the series is Russia scores in bunches. And they score 4 goals at the end of the second period to take a 5-3 lead. So Russia is now 20 minutes away from winning the series. Back home, it is basically an unofficial civic holiday in Canada. Schools, businesses, governments have all closed down so people can watch all over. In fact, for about 30 years, it holds the record for the most watched sports broadcast in the history of the country. The only thing that has topped it since is the gold medal game of the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. So everyone back home is watching. And Phil Esposito basically decides they're not losing. He scores the first goal to make it 5-4, but immediately he notices, despite the fact that the refs called it a goal and the Russian players knew it was a goal and were acting as such, the goal judge behind the net And for those of you who don't know, the goal judge is the person who turns the red light on, or was, to signal a goal. He does not turn the red light on. So Eagleson, who's in the crowd, immediately senses shenanigans. He races over to try and get at the goal judge to ask him why the red light didn't come on. At which point, the Russian guards then grab him and try to drag him off underneath the stairs. The Canadian team, who had all come out on the ice to celebrate the goal to ensure that the refs actually called it a goal, see this and start reaching over the boards, stabbing at the Russian guards with their sticks to keep them from taking Eagleson out of the arena.
That sounds like some mob shit.
And one of the players basically says, we were stabbing at them with sticks while they had machine guns. It didn't seem like a good idea at the time, but we did it anyway.
It's not really a fair fight.
Once the Russian guards realize that he's part of the Canadian envoy, they let him go. And Eagleson spends the rest of the game on the Canadian bench, because that's technically at that point Canadian soil. There's also a bunch of Canadian fans who actually traveled to Moscow to watch the game. There was a nationwide lottery to go to these games, and I think it was about 5,000 people went. And they're screaming and cheering during the anthem. Esposito then scores again to tie the game. So it's at 5-5. So now the next goal is probably going to win the game. Russia is playing for a tie because they feel that even if the game is tied, that because they scored more goals, they would win on total goals, and they would claim a victory on that. So Canada then determines they have to score again. And so Esposito puts a shot on net. It bumbles around the front of the net, and Paul Henderson happens to be there, and he scores with about a minute left to put Canada up 6-5. And it's considered by a lot of people to be one of the most famous goals in the history of the sport.
As you were talking about Esposito and his goals, I'm like, well, where did Henderson go? But there he goes, clutch.
He scores the biggest goal in the history of Canada. And Canada ends up winning the series, holding on and winning the game and winning the series, to the great relief of an entire country, who then give them a hero's welcome back in Montreal, along with the Prime Minister, where about thousands of people are waiting for them at the airport when they arrive in the middle of the night. Everyone kind of gets what they want out of this. Canada wins, and they get to claim superiority. Russia gets the respect they won on the world stage, and the respect from Canada as being a superpower in the sport.
So that was enough for the Russians?
After a while, Tretiak, the goaltender, who ends up later is elected to the Hall of Fame himself, he gives an interview where first he says that the Henderson goal was caused by a higher power, that it was God caused that goal to happen for Canada. He also then says that I was exhausted, and the pain of losing was diminished by how physically and mentally exhausted I was. And at the end of the day, these were just two great teams playing each other. And for the Russian players, individually, they would tell you that losing didn't diminish what they had accomplished, which was the entire world seeing how good they were.
I have a question that's kind of on a tangent, but what was the reaction from the United States? Was this even on the radar? Did they care? What was the sentiment in the U.S. at that point?
The series wasn't really shown. The places where the series was shown were really markets where where teams were already playing. So Boston sent their own announcers that broadcast the 4 Canadian games. It was also shown in Chicago. In fact, it was the PBS station in Boston who actually brokered a deal to simulcast the CBC feed for the 4 games in Moscow. And that was really the only television exposure that America had to this. There was a reporter from the New York Times who covered it, but other than that, that was really kind of it. It's an important little footnote in the Cold War, but it kind of gets lost because it doesn't involve America.
Well, that's what I was kind of going for. Like, did it even really matter because the US wasn't involved?
A lot of people don't know don't know about this.
I have never heard of this.
Yeah. After this happens in 1972, that the Soviet Union begins to branch outwards, and the team starts to play outside Russia. In 1976, they actually play a couple of exhibition games against NHL teams in the U.S. They play, I know they play the Rangers, and I think they played either Boston or Chicago. One of the games they play is in 1976, and they play in the Spectrum in Philadelphia against the Flyers.
So, like I just said, I've never heard of the Canada versus Russia story, but my dad very much has grown up in the area as well, and I heard a lot of details about that game and what happened. It's very infamous, not only I think in the U.S., but in the general Northeast as well.
It's very infamous, not really because of the result of the game, but more what happens during the game. So the Philadelphia Flyers at that time had a reputation.
A reputation, to say the least. Yeah.
They had very much kind of built their brand off of no one's going to physically bully us.
So their nickname back then, they're really not referred to this today. It's definitely, the franchise has changed, obviously, but they were known as the Broad Street Bullies.
And they got that nickname because one of their early playoff series, they were physically beaten up by their opponent. And the owner, Ed Snyder, had said, this isn't happening again. And so he got a bunch of North American big, beefy hitting boys. And boy, they hit. They hit you. Not surprisingly, the Flyers used this opportunity to do what Canada did to Russia, which is physically pound them. Trips, interference, just hitting them, not violent hits, but physical enough to make them very annoyed. And that's when, in the middle of the first period, Russia decides they're not going to play anymore. They're going to actually walk off the ice until the referees get quote unquote get control of the game. The game was broadcast in both America and in Canada. Marv Albert broadcast the game in America, but no one's really heard that call. If you've heard anything from this game, you've heard the velvet dulcet tones of one Mr. Robert Bob Cole of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who said, "They're going home. Yeah, they're going home."
From the video footage that I've seen, and also a lot of what my dad has told me, it was very much like disbelief that they're just done. They're not coming back. You know what I mean?
Philadelphia fans, who of course are very reserved and subtle.
Never. Absolutely never.
There's a famous sign that someone put up at that game saying, "Tell it to the Tsar." So the Russian team agrees to come back out and finishes the game, but the Flyers do win. And it's seen as kind of a triumph for North American hockey. That was also built around the 1976 Olympics. The Russian team would use playing against AHL teams as kind of a ramp up and an exhibition into the Winter Olympics.
But just to point out, so the Flyers at the time, again, to give some context, were a super hot team. They won the Cup back-to-back years in 74 and 75 or 75 and 76?
74 and 75. 76, they lose to Montreal. Montreal wins 4 in a row from 76 to 79.
So they were huge at this time, and they were very much on the radar, of the NHL in the U.S.
And they were superstars in their town. They ran the city of Philadelphia. They were extremely popular guys. Still are in a lot of respect. Just influenced by the fact that a lot of them still live in that area.
And honestly, just the history of the franchise, I think, is just very unique to us, or unique to Philadelphia.
Yeah. Again, noticed by the fact that a lot of them stayed. Bernie Perrant now, I think, owns a Chevy dealership in South Jersey. So they do this again in 1980, where they play NHL teams as a ramp up to the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid. It's at this point where Russia, just like Canada did, falls victim to its own hubris when they lose to a bunch of no-name college players from the United States in what will be termed the Miracle on Ice.
So at that point, that rule that no professional like NHL players could play in the Olympic, that was still in place.
That was still in place.
Yeah, okay.
A couple of players from that U.S. team did go on and play in the NHL, most notably Kenny Morrow, but though they were all college players at the time this happened. Soon after, by the late 80s, you're starting to see players defect from Russia, from the Soviet Union, and basically sneak out of the country so they can play in North America. And when they do that, they bring a lot of the tactics that Russia had used so successfully on the ice start to filter their way into America. There's a really smart coach in Detroit in the mid-90s named Scotty Bowman, and he basically hoards Russian players.
Detroit was very good in the 90s from what I remember.
They were extremely good.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the reason why they were good was their European scouting department was better than everyone else.
Was this the point where you start to see more finesse in the game in the NHL? Because when you were talking about that before, I kind of was thinking about it. I'm like, I don't feel like we saw less brutal physicality until the 90s when it was more finesse hockey and more skill to it, right?
It was. So by the 90s, when Russian players are starting to come over, it's not the high scoring game that it was in the 80s when you had the prime of Gretzky. It's a much different skill. So by the early 90s, when you're starting to see, the Alexander Mogilny, he was one of the first ones from Buffalo. Pavel Bure, and there's a whole story about Pavel Bure in Vancouver and whether or not he was eligible at the draft. And Brian Burke, who was the GM of Vancouver, being the only one who knew he was at the time. Detroit finds both young and old players to come over. So Detroit basically implements the 5-man unit the same way that the Red Army does. And they do it with Sergei Fedorov, Igor Larionov, Slava Kozlov, Vladimir Konstantinov, and Slava Fetisov. And they all play on the ice at the same time.
I remember hearing Sergei Fedorov's name a lot back in the 90s. Yeah.
And he was really, really good. And so was Konstantinov. Konstantinov was extremely good. It's extremely tragic what happened to him with his car accident, and he ended up being paralyzed. And that's another, unfortunately, very tragic story. But a lot of what the Russian team did ends up filtering through. And a lot of what we see now are things that the Russians did 30 years ago that were just never done here. With everything, you have coaches, you have players that take what they saw there and they implement it over here. And so there's a lot of Red Army influence in the way the game is played now. That also doesn't change the fact that it was still a smaller kind of watershed moment in the Cold War. It was really one of the first looks behind, quote unquote, behind the Iron Curtain, were these telecasts from Moscow. It's very much kind of a watershed moment because while I think the players understood what they had accomplished individually, it's still a very bruised ego moment for the government, who is very, very invested in wins and losses. And not just in hockey, but in any sort of international competition. Because again, it was always about winning was a reaffirmation of their political might and their political will and their political belief system.
It just really kind of blows my mind how much that was tied into this, because you would think that it would it would kind of be inconsequential to some hockey games. You know what I mean? I never realized when you first told me the story that that was going to be such a big part of it for them.
You wouldn't think so, but again, they saw sports as a way to as a affirmation of what they were doing. To the government, it was an affirmation that communism worked. It was an affirmation that the Soviet Union worked. It was an affirmation that they were doing the right thing. Again, this was all, and it was all done under the guise of victories, and also at the same time, it was very simply just a show of might.
Question for you, just on your opinion. Do you think if the outcome had been different, if the Canadians would have absolutely embarrassed the Russians, what socio-political impact do you think that would have had on the Cold War? Do you think would it have lessened Russia's, I guess, hubris?
I don't know if it would have lessened Russia's hubris. I think the players would have had punishment.
Okay, yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't think it would have changed anything in the grand scheme of things. The government invested a large amount of time, money, effort, energy, and resources into sport because it was always about showing the prowess and the power of the machine. And that was done by dominating athletic competition wherever it was. It was basically about just making sure the machine ran at all time, and part of the machine was pumping out athletes that would dominate on the international stage. The documentary goes into the fact that a lot of the players were scouted from the time they were 6 years old, 7 years old, and they would play these games where basically coaches that were also doubled as government officials would basically go and scout them and weed out the best players, and they would go to camps where basically they just stayed there and they lived, breathed, and ate hockey or whatever sport they were playing.
That's a lot of pressure on these little kids.
Yeah, and that's where how a lot of these athletes grew up, because you were not just an athlete, you were expected to win in servants of the state. It all went back to kind of governmental and military and political might.
And I guess, and knowing how much you love hockey too, it's just a shame to me that all of that overshadowed just the game.
The Russian government was going to take from this whatever they wanted to take from this, and they were going to spin it however the way they wanted to spin it. Where I think if Canada had lost, I think you would have seen a nation in crisis to some extent, and you probably would have seen an entire examination of the way they were doing things.
That makes sense.
Russia was always going to, the Russian government, I should say, was always going to kind of spin this however they were going to. We want to know what you guys think about this. First of all, we want to know if you're familiar with the series. We want to know what your thoughts are. If you happen to watch it, if you remember watching it live, we definitely want to know what your thoughts are on this and what your memories of it were, or just what you know. So we definitely want to hear from you guys. Reach out to us at the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. We're at the Tell Me About Podcast on Instagram and on TikTok. And coming soon, you can reach us at the Tell Me About Podcast on YouTube. We're going to be posting some clips from the episodes and putting them up with some visuals. So we'll send those out once we get that up and running, which we hope to do in the next, couple episodes. And, we'd love to see you there and interact with you there as well.
So one of our internal running jokes is that we've been covering a lot of episodes that have people that are indicted. And I think the last handful of episodes, we haven't had any indictments, but that is going to change with my topic next week. There are going to be a lot of indictments and a lot of people convicted of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm excited to tell you that story.
Join us again on America's favorite true crime indictment podcast. Have a great week, everyone.
See you next week, everybody.